So we're in First Kings again this morning. First Kings, we're looking at the seventh chapter of First Kings. So First Kings chapter 7, and we're going to look at all 51 verses, Lord willing, if the Lord doesn't come back before we get to the end of First Kings chapter 7. But we'll go through the furnishing of the temple. I kind of see First Kings 7 as the world's oldest Pinterest board. This is kind of like 1 Kings 7 is the Pinterest board for Solomon's palace and Solomon's temple. I call it that because the way it records is as if someone walked through Solomon's palace and then they walked past the temple and then they were like, oh, this is really interesting to note and this is interesting to note. And that's sort of the description we have of the palace and the temple. And the reason I say it's kind of odd with somebody just pointing things out is that the longest item that we have described for us here in 1 Kings chapter 7 is, I'm going to guess if you had a trivia question, like what was described with more detail in Solomon's temple than anything else? I don't think anyone would guess what got more volume of words describing it than anything else in Solomon's temple. It was the bronze carts that are used to bring the water to the sea, the giant, bathing bowl of water in the middle of the temple. So the bronze carts carrying in water gets the most description of anything in Solomon's temple. So it's just kind of odd what gets focused and what doesn't here. But we're going to look at the furnishing of the temple, and we got a lot to cover, obviously, because we're looking at 51 verses. So we're going to start with 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 1. But Solomon took 13 years to build his own house, so he finished all his house. I think the best way to view Solomon's palace is that it was spectacular, but it did not impress God. We need to remember that I believe one of the themes of these chapters in 1 Kings is that the Lord does not give a great care and concern for the palaces and the spectacular buildings of man. God is not swayed by what we build. He's not swayed by what we cover with gold or silver or precious stones. I don't believe he's offended by them, but it's not like God's going to be like, oh, these are my special people just because they built this wonderful big building for me. God doesn't care about that. One of the reasons I say that is because the last verse in chapter 6 was that it took Solomon 7 years to build the temple. So he took 7 years to build the temple, and then he took 13 years to build his own palace. So we have them contrasted by showing that the palace of Solomon was much larger, it was much grander than the temple itself. We also need to remember that the palace of Solomon wasn't just like his house where he lived, but it functioned more as like the White House today. It's where they did the central functions of government in his palace. So it's more like the headquarters for the entire nation of Israel. But it's much grander than the temple overall. But the way that it's minimized is that we have this long section of 173 verses that are describing the temple and the building of the temple. Well, right sort of in the middle of that, we have 12 verses given to Solomon's palace. So the fact that they're sort of smushed right in the middle of the description of the temple, they're only giving 12 verses, shows that God himself has minimal emphasis on Solomon's palace that was given. So while this is going to be a grand description, it is not something that impresses our God. So the first part of Solomon's palace is described in 1 Kings 7, verses 2 through 5. He also built the house of the forest of Lebanon. Its length was 100 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits, with 4 rows of cedar pillars and cedar beams on the pillars. And it was paneled with cedar above the beams that were 45 pillars, 15 to a row. There were windows with beveled frames in 3 rows, and window was opposite window in 3 tiers. And all the doorways and doorposts had rectangular frames, and window was opposite window in 3 tiers. So I take the house of the forest of Lebanon possibly to be a description for the entire complex of these various halls and various functions that took place in the palace of Solomon. It was called that because the main feature of all of these different halls were these massive cedar pillars that would have just dwarfed anyone who's walking into this grand structure with these great pillars. It would probably hurt your neck as you're straightened up a little bit to look at the massive sights that are around you with the palace that Solomon built. Now, this structure in length is about the length of half a football field. So we're talking about 50 yards long, and it is 3 stories tall. But one of the interesting things to sort of point out how little we know about these structures is, like, take this main central hall. We're not even sure if it was a roofed structure, because a lot of people built these type of great halls during this time period that had these massive pillars and walls in them, but they didn't put roofs on them. They had them open to the elements, and we don't know whether Solomon's was one that was roofed or it was open to the elements and had no roof at all. Like, that's how little we know about these halls that Solomon built. But regardless, they would have been amazing, grand structures. And then we have the next section of the temple, which is called the Hall of Pillars in verse 6. He also made the Hall of Pillars. Its length was 50 cubits and its width 30 cubits. And in front of them was a portico with pillars, and a canopy was in front of them. So notice they had a canopy when you'd enter, but possibly not in the main part of the structure. So it appears, again, the central feature of the Palace of Solomon was just on these massive halls. And while we know the purpose for the third hall that's going to come up in the next verse, the purpose for these first two, we don't know. Like, did they have dinners in there? Did they welcome dignitaries? Like what was going on in these massive halls? Were they just to show how grand Solomon's building programs were? We don't really even know. But the third hall is given its purpose in verse 7. Then he made a hall for the throne, the hall of judgment, where he might judge. And it was paneled with cedar from floor to ceiling. So this is the only one that we have that explicitly says it has a ceiling all throughout it, which would totally make sense. Like, if this is going to be where Solomon's going to sit throughout the day and make his judgments upon the people, you'd imagine you'd want a roof above your head for that type of a function. So here's where Solomon held his legal proceedings. But the interesting thing about this third hall, and this is sort of showing how we are getting these sort of random details about all of these. We don't know if the first two even had a roof. We know the third one does, but the third hall, we're not told how tall it was. We're not told how long it is. We're not given any of the details, just that this is where Solomon is doing his legal proceedings. So we have all these very, very limited descriptions of Solomon's palace. And then we have the living quarters in verse 8. And the house where he dwelt had another court inside the hall of like workmanship. Solomon also made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken as wife. So scholars are in agreement that the reason that they mention in the text of the separate living quarters for Pharaoh's daughter was just to demonstrate how massive this palace was. That not only did Solomon have his own living quarters, but the daughter of Pharaoh, she had her own living quarters. And there's probably a strong likelihood that certain other wives would have had their own living quarters, maybe areas where certain ones lived together, just showing this was just a sprawling, massive, opulent house in which Solomon was living. So this is just to point out the extravagance of what Solomon built. And then now we get our final description of the palace overall in verses 9 through 12. All these were of costly stones cut to size, trimmed with saws inside and out from the foundation to the eaves, and also on the outside to the great court. The foundation was of costly stones, large stones, some 10 cubits and some 8 cubits. And above all were costly stones hewn to size and cedar wood. The great court was enclosed with 3 rows of hewn stone and a row of cedar beams. So were the inner court of the house of the Lord and the vestibule of the temple. So remember, at this time period, cedar is more costly than gold. So highlighting the cedar is just showing how expensive and opulent the palace is. The other thing that's highlighted here is the blocks that were used to build Solomon's palace, as well as the temple. And it says the blocks were either 10 cubits in length or 8 cubits in length. We're talking massive stones here. Like, these things are big. They're so huge, as a matter of fact, that if it was not for the temple that Herod would later build, and then for the pyramids that were built in Egypt, The assumption by scholars would have been there's no way that Solomon could have used stone blocks that big. Like, it's too big. How could they have cut them? How could they have moved them? Like how did that even happen? And the only reason that scholars begrudgingly say, yeah, I guess he probably had stones that large is because we have other buildings that also had stones of that size. And what sort of baffles all of them is that we're like, I have no idea. We don't know how they moved these stones into place. We don't know how they set them. Like how did they have the ability to transport them and put them in the building? We don't know how that even worked for what they were able to do to build that. But this just shows that Solomon's temple was grand. It was impressive. But remember, I think the subtext for all of this is that no matter how impressive this may look to the person who is walking by or walking through the halls, the one person who is not impressed by Solomon's palace is the person who created the entire world, because he made the whole world. So this little palace is just this one, kind of micro machine sized thing in the middle of the world, and God is not overly impressed. So if you live for your own glory, know that what you're doing in living for your own glory will not at all impress your Creator. So you might as well live for your Creator. And now we're going to transition back to the temple in verses 13 to 22 with a description of the bronze pillars that sat before the temple. Now Solomon sent and brought Hiram from Tyre. He was the son of a widow from the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a bronze worker. He was filled with wisdom and understanding and skill in working with all kinds of bronze work. So he came to King Solomon and did all his work. And he cast 2 pillars of bronze, each one 18 cubits high, and a line of 12 cubits measured the circumference of each. Then he made 2 capitals of cast bronze to set on the tops of the pillars. The height of the one capital was 5 cubits, and the height of the other capital was 5 cubits. He made a lattice network with wreaths of chainworks for the capitals, which were on top of the pillars. 7 chains for one capital and 7 for the other capital. So he made the pillars and the 2 rows of pomegranates above the network all around to cover the capitals that were on top, and thus he did for the other capital. The capitals, which were on top of the pillars in the hall, were in the shape of lilies, 4 cubits. The capitals on the 2 pillars also had pomegranates above, by the convex surface which was next to the network. And there were 200 such pomegranates in rows on each of the capitals all around. Then he set up the pillars by the vestibule of the temple. He set up the pillars on the right, and he called its name Jachin. And he set up the pillar on the left, and he called its name Boaz. The tops of the pillars were in the shape of lilies, so the work of the pillars was finished. Whew. All right, so we're here with the furnishings of the temple. And the bulk of the descriptions regarding the furnishings of the temple relate to the bronze work of Hiram of Tyre. Now, interesting, I don't know why they did this, but in the New King James Version and in the NIV, instead of saying Hiram, Hiram, they write Huram, Huram. My guess is that possibly they're doing this is because they want to let the reader know that the Hiram of Tyre, who is doing all this bronze work, is not the same as the Hiram of Tyre, who was the king of Tyre during this time period. But I don't know why they have the different spelling, because they're literally the same name in Hebrew. Like, there's no difference in spelling for this. And we know that there are different Hirams because this Hiram is one who is half Israelite. So he's not the king of Tyre during this time. They just happen to share the same name. So same name, different guy. That shouldn't surprise us or even be all that confusing or shocking, because, I mean, just think about in our own history. Like when the United States went to war against England, and we went to war against King George. Like, I think you could find 1 or 2 other guys in England who also had the name of George during that time period and were not the king of England. So the fact that you have another Hiram living in Tyre, like, not surprising at all. And this was one who was half Israelite. So we have this other Hiram who's doing this bronze work. And the first bronze work that is described is these 2 massive pillars. So these pillars are 27 feet high. They have a circumference around them of 18 feet. So I almost think they're more impressive in how round they are in comparison to how tall they are. And then the top of each of these pillars has a capital, which is a decorative feature that's on the top of the pillar. And that decorative feature adds another 7 feet on top of the 27 feet. So they are in total 34 feet tall. Now, there's a lot of debate about these bronze pillars, if they're used to support the front of the temple or if they were simply freestanding in front of the temple itself. And most of the scholars today, for reasons that I can't really tell based on what's in the narrative, believe that they were freestanding monuments. Now, the name of the pillars were Jachin and Boaz. And those two Hebrew names, when you bring them together, the meaning of those names is Yahweh will establish his people with strength. So these two pillars with their two names together, Jachin and Boaz, means Yahweh will establish his people with strength. So the idea is we are secure in our land, and the reason we are secure and strong in our land is because of the work of God among his people. So as you first come into this temple, you're supposed to be awed by these amazing pillars that are before you, to be like, wow, what spectacular things we have built. But then the message of these pillars is meant to be, well, we weren't able to build these amazing things because of our ingenuity and our strength and our capability, but it is because of the gifts of the Lord and what it is that God has done for his people, to bring them out of Egypt into the promised land and to establish them in this land with strength. So the first description is of these two bronze pillars at the front of the temple. And now we have the great sea in verses 23 to 26. And he, that is Hiram, made the sea of cast bronze, 10 cubits from one brim to the other. It was completely round. Its height was 5 cubits, and a line of 30 cubits measured its circumference. Below its brim were ornamental buds encircling it all around, 10 to a cubit, all the way around the sea. The ornamental buds were cast in 2 rows when it was cast. It stood on 12 oxen, 3 looking to the north, 3 looking to the west, 3 looking to the south, 3 looking to the east. And the sea was set upon them, and all their back parts pointed inward. It was a hand's breadth thick, and its brim was shaped like the brim of a cup, like a lily blossom, and it contained 2,000 baths. So the sea that we have in front of the temple is a large circular bath. It's a big tub. It's meant for cleaning and sanctifying in the midst of the sacrificial offerings and the work of the priests and the Levites in the temple. I think one thing that we don't always appreciate in our very sanitary 21st century world, where we always have, cleaning wipes and hand sanitizer nearby, like we see a little stain on the carpet and we're like, oh no, there's a stain on the carpet. Like we're all about our cleanliness now. Is I think one thing we don't appreciate is how violent and bloody and dirty the sacrifices would have been before the temple. If you are slaughtering dozens and at times even hundreds of animals before the temple, you know what you're going to need to do a lot of? A lot of washing. And so they have this massive sea in order to do that washing in front of the temple. So a few things about this washing basin that they've built there. First, it is so large. This thing is massive. It is 15 feet in diameter. The circumference is 45 feet. It would have held 11,000 gallons of water when entirely full. Like it would have just dwarfed the priests whenever they approached this giant bath. It also sat on 12 bowls who were cast in bronze as well, with 3 of them looking in each direction from north, south, east, and west. So we just have this very beautiful, impressive, large structure to simply hold the water for their bathing. And I believe that this washing basin basically also served for a theological purpose when you look at how it was designed and also how it was named. First, it was named the sea. And one of the interesting things is that the sea is the great adversary of the Canaanite god Baal. So the supreme god of the Canaanites, Baal, his greatest adversary that he did his most magnificent battles with in their writings was the sea. So this is Baal's like top foe and top adversary. And I think part of the purposes of calling this washing basin, to call it the sea, is to show that the great adversary against the God of the Canaanites, him before Yahweh, is just like a servant there for you to use to wash your hands. Like it's nothing before God. God doesn't need to do battle with the sea. The sea submits before the awesome creative power of our Lord. So it's symbolizing the Lord's power before the local gods. And I also believe that there's another element in this to show God's superiority, and that is to have the oxen that the sea were set upon. And I think that this might have been pointing back to Mount Sinai. Because if you remember, when Moses went up with the 10 Commandments on the mountain, what did the Israelites do when Moses was on the mountain? They crafted a fake god. And that fake god was a calf. It was a child oxen. And what did they say about that oxen? They said, "This is Yahweh who brought you out of Egypt." And I think part of the design structure of having these 12 oxen with the sea on top of them was to overly emphasize that Israel has learned his lesson. Yahweh is not an oxen. Yahweh is not a calf. Instead, the ox and the calf, they are under the thumb of Yahweh. They are another part of the created order that is in submission to the Lord. So no longer will the Israelites bow down before the golden calf and say, "This is our God." They will use the golden calf to simply hold the water for which they will cleanse themselves before they worship the Lord himself. So I think the design of this massive sea, which would have definitely, focused your eyes upon as soon as you walked into the temple proper structure, was meant to show the superiority of God to the spiritual and physical powers of creation. God reigns supreme. And now we come to the longest description of anything in the temple, as I mentioned at the beginning of this. And the longest description of anything in the temple is the bronze carts that bring out the water. And please bear with me as I read verses 27 through 39. So Hiram also made 10 carts of bronze. 4 cubits was the length of each cart, 4 cubits its width, and 3 cubits its height. And this was the design of the carts. They had panels, and the panels were between frames. On the panels that were between the frames were lions, oxen, and cherubims. And on the frames was a pedestal on top. Below the lions and oxen were wreaths of plated work. Each cart had 4 bronze wheels and axles of bronze, and its 4 feet had supports. Under the laver were supports of cast bronze beside each wreath. Its opening inside the crown at the top was 1 cubit in diameter, and the opening was round, shaped like a pedestal, 1.5 cubits in outer diameter, and also on the opening were engravings. But the panels were square, not round. Under the panels were 4 wheels, and the axles of the wheels were joined to the cart. The height of a wheel was 1.5 cubits. The workmanship of the wheels was like the workmanship of a chariot wheel. Their axle pins, their rims, their spokes, and their hubs were all of cast bronze. And there were 4 supports at the 4 corners of each cart. Its supports were part of the cart itself. On the top of the cart, at the height of 0.5 cubit, it was perfectly round. And on the top of the cart, its phalanges and its panels were of the same casting. On the plates of its phalanges and on its panels, he engraved cherubims, lions, and palm trees, wherever there was a clear space on each with wreaths all around. Thus he made the 10 carts. All of them were of the same mold, one measure, and one shape. Then he made 10 lavers of bronze. Each laver contained 40 baths, and each laver was 4 cubits. On each of the 10 carts was a laver. And he put 5 carts on the right side of the house and 5 on the left side of the house. And he set the sea on the right side of the house toward the southeast. I don't know about you, but if I was describing Solomon's temple, I don't think I would have used this much space and detail for the carts that were meant to bring water into the sea. It seems very odd to me that you give this much space in the biblical narrative about these carts. But then I read a little bit more about these carts, and reading more about them, I felt like, yeah, I could see why you might want to describe them so much. One, you notice that it says there's these designs all on the outside of them, which probably really captured, a lot of beauty and craftsmanship that went into them. But not only did they have a lot of design in them, but each cart was built to carry 200 gallons of water. So these aren't like cheap little carts that you're going to have to move something from the kitchen out to the dining room. These carts carried 200 gallons of water. They were so big, in fact, that once filled with water, they were most likely so large that they required draft animals like oxen or massive horses in order to pull these carts into place. That's how large they were. So it must have been quite the sight to go up to the temple and on either side along these temples to see these massively large carts, beautifully decorated with bronze, each carrying 200 gallons of water, being pulled by a team of horses or a great oxen in order to bring the water up to the sea. Like, it just must have been some kind of an impressive sight. So I try to remind myself of that when I read this, so that if my eyes start to glaze over, I say to yourself, Sean, if you were there, you would probably have been just as awed by these amazingly crafted and large carts that were beside the temple. So they get a lot of details, but they were probably some sight to behold. And now we get the summary of the rest of Hiram's work in verses 40 to 47. Hiram made the lavers and the shovels and the bowls. So Hiram finished doing all the work that he was to do for King Solomon for the house of the Lord. The two pillars, the two bowl-shaped capitals that were on top of the two pillars, the two networks covering the two bowl-shaped capitals which were on top of the pillars, 400 pomegranates for the two networks, 2 rows of pomegranates for each network to cover the two bowl-shaped capitals that were on top of the pillars. Then 10 carts and 10 lavers on the carts, 1 sea and 12 oxen under the sea. The pots, the shovels, and the bowls. All these articles which Hiram made for King Solomon, for the house of the Lord, were of burnished bronze. In the plain of Jordan, the king had made them cast in clay molds between Succoth and Zeraton. And Solomon did not weigh all the articles because there were so many. The weight of the bronze was not determined. So this is a summary of the work that was done by Hiram. And I think the most noteworthy part of this paragraph is to read that everything that was built and cast, it was cast in the plains of Jordan and then transported up into the hills, or you could say the mountains of where Jerusalem sat. Most likely the moving of all of these articles might have been the most impressive part of the entire building of the temple and Solomon's palace. So this was probably some amazing kind of engineering feat. It really speaks to Solomon's wisdom, probably not in the fact that Solomon himself figured out how to transport all of these stuff, but that Solomon was wise enough to find talented individuals who could move all of these stuff. And a lot of praise is given, obviously, to the half-Israelite Hiram, to craft all of these items that were made. So we have that summary statement. And then now finally, as sort of like an interesting conclusion to the end, we finally get the gold articles that were put in the temple itself. And that's in verses 48 to 51. Thus Solomon had all the furnishings made for the house of the Lord: the altar of gold and the table of gold on which was the showbread, the lampstands of pure gold, 5 on the right side and 5 on the left in front of the inner sanctuary, with the flowers and the lamps and the wick trimmers of gold, the basins, the trimmers, the bowls, the ladles, and the censers of pure gold, and the hinges of gold, both for the doors of the inner room, the most holy place, and for the doors of the main hall of the temple. So all the work that King Solomon had done for the house of the Lord was finished. And Solomon brought the things which his father had dedicated, the silver and the gold and the furnishings, and he put them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. So it's just fascinating my assumption would be that if Sean Wilson went back in time and I was going to describe things with Solomon's temple, I would really zero in on describing the gold items that are actually in the temple itself. But instead, what we read here in the biblical narrative is what gets all of the space for the description. It's the bronze items that are outside of the temple itself. And I think that this is actually really important to note that we think from our perspective that we would, we talk about the altar in the temple. We talk about the Ark of the Covenant. We talked about all the gold things that are in there. The altar of incense. We describe all of that stuff in detail. But the person who writes this doesn't. And to me, this screams that the author of 1 Kings 7 was a personal eyewitness to the items that were put inside the temple and to the temple itself. The reason I say that this screams an eyewitness is that what could any Jew see when he went up to the temple? Any Jew who went up to the temple grounds would get a sight of the sea with the oxen under it. Any Jew who went up to the temple grounds would see the large carts there that are of it. All of them would see the great bronze pillars that are in front of the temple. But would your average Jew even see the articles of gold that are inside the temple? He wouldn't even see them. So this leads me to believe that the author of 1 Kings probably wasn't even a Levite. This is somebody who probably never saw the articles of gold that were inside the temple. He was just simply told, here are the things that are inside the temple, like the altar of incense, the table of showbread, and so forth. So he's told about those things. He knows they're gold. He knows they're in there because of the testimony of other people, but he hasn't seen them himself. So what can't he do because he hasn't seen them himself? He can't go into a detailed description about what they look like. He can only talk about what he saw for himself. And the fact that the details are set up this way really says to me, okay, we got a really ancient description of whatever scribe went in and got to see the temple for himself and sees what outside of it and is told by the Levites the gold items that are inside of it. So this really, to me, points to the antiquity of this description that we have here and shows that this was a legitimate description of what we would have had in the temple itself. But I think it is interesting that that the shortest description is given for those items that are in there itself and not what's outside. And I also think that this, again, has a spiritual benefit for us as well, because it illustrates for us, for the average Israelite, what life experience would they have with what's inside the temple? None. What life experience would they actually have with the Ark of the Covenant? None. It was set apart from them, behind the veil, inside the temple. They couldn't have that relation with God. It wasn't available for them. So now the fact today that the temple curtain has been torn, we can go right to Jesus Christ. We have full opening to the throne of God, thanks to our mediator who sits at God's glory, really shows the great benefit that we have in the church today. So even the description of the temple itself, I think, really highlights the wonderful glory we have in Jesus in being able to go straight to the throne room of God today, because that was cut off from the Jews in the time of Solomon. So there's our description of the furnishings of the temple. And next week, I'm still wrestling with how much of the dedication I want to try to do in 1 week. Do I do all of it? Do I split it up in a couple of weeks? We'll see what we get to next week when we go to it. But next week, we'll be looking at Solomon's long dedication of the temple in 1 Kings chapter 8.